The roar of the C-130 military transport plane drowned out even Stephen's own thoughts. Through the porthole, there was nothing but the infinite, blindingly white expanse of Antarctica, merging seamlessly with an equally white sky. Stephen gripped his backpack tighter. After signing a 30-page non-disclosure agreement, his life had turned into a one-way ticket to a facility codenamed Point Zero. 5 minutes to touchdown, the pilot shouted without looking back. Stephen nodded. He had been hired as a life support systems technician. The pay here was 10 times higher than in the civilian world, but now he was starting to understand why. There were no roads here, no connection to the outside world, only ice and a cold capable of killing in a matter of minutes. When the ski landing gear hit the packed snow, Stephen felt a violent jolt. The door opened, and a rush of frigid air burst in, instantly catching his breath. A man in a heavy parka with a hood pulled low over his eyes was waiting for him on the strip. "Stephen, I'm Marcus, the shift lead," the man said. He didn't offer a hand, only nodding toward a massive steel dome barely rising above the snow. "Move it before the blizzard hits. The weather here changes faster than you can blink." Point Zero turned out to be far more massive than Stephen had imagined. Most of it extended deep beneath the ice. As they entered the airlock and the heavy armored door hissed shut, sealing them in, Stephen felt a strange vibration under his feet. "What's that?" he asked, pulling off his heavy coat. "Generators," Marcus said curtly, "and drills. We're deep core drilling into the ice shelf. Found something interesting." Inside, the base looked sterile and unwelcoming. Narrow corridors painted a dull gray, flickering fluorescent lights, and the smell of ozone mixed with cheap coffee. But what struck Stephen most was the silence. Despite the fact that there were supposed to be about 40 people on base, the hallways were empty. Marcus led him to the living quarters, a tiny room with a bed bolted to the floor and a desk. "Your shift starts tomorrow at 6 a.m. Rest up today. And Stephen," Marcus paused in the doorway, "if you hear any scraping in the vents at night, don't pay it any mind. The pipes expand from the temperature fluctuations. It's just physics." When the door closed, Stephen sat on the bed. He looked up at the ventilation grate near the ceiling. Was it his imagination, or did a sound come from in there? Something that sounded more like ragged, wet breathing than metallic expansion? Stephen turned off the light, but lay in the dark for a long time, listening to the drill working deep beneath him in the ancient ice, gnawing into secrets that were better left buried. Stephen's sleep was fitful and heavy. He dreamed that the ice above was closing in, turning the base into a giant sarcophagus. Waking to the sharp blare of the siren announcing the start of the shift, he spent several minutes just staring at the ceiling, trying to steady the tremors in his hands. Breakfast in the mess hall was conducted in an oppressive silence. Stephen sat down with a group of technicians, hoping to strike up a conversation. "Hey, hi, I'm Stephen, the new life support systems specialist," he began, trying to sound friendly. A middle-aged man with deep bags under his eyes slowly looked up from his oatmeal. His spoon froze in midair. The other two didn't even turn their heads. "Stephen, then," the technician rasped. "Word of advice, Stephen. Do your job and don't ask questions. That's not encouraged here." "I just wanted to ask about the drilling depth," Stephen pushed on. "Marcus said yesterday they found something interesting." "What exactly?" The technician suddenly went pale. He stood up abruptly, nearly knocking over his tray, and walked out of the mess hall with quick strides. His companions followed him without a word. Stephen was left alone under the gaze of the security cameras, which, he felt, were tracking his every move. His assignment for the day included checking the seal integrity of the units in Sector G, the lowest level of the base, adjacent to the drill shaft. As he went down in the elevator, Stephen felt the temperature drop. The walls here were no longer lined with plastic. It was bare concrete, coated in frost. Walking through the corridors, he noticed a strange detail. Many of the doors had additional deadbolts installed on the outside. It was as if the rooms were designed so that no one could get out. Near one of the technical airlocks, he encountered a woman in a white lab coat. She was feverishly fiddling with a distribution panel. "Excuse me," Stephen said. "I need to check the cooling system pressure for this block. Could you tell me why there's so much security here?" He pointed to two armed men at the end of the hall who stood with their backs to them, staring toward the shaft. The woman flinched and dropped her screwdriver. Stephen leaned down to pick up the tool and noticed her hands were trembling slightly. Her fingertips rubbed raw, as if she had been trying to scrape something away. "Don't ask them," she whispered, not looking at him. "They aren't here to protect us from the outside world. There are no enemies in Antarctica except the cold itself." "Then why are they here?" Stephen lowered his voice to a whisper. She finally looked at him. Her eyes held such primal terror that Stephen felt an urge to run back to the plane. "To make sure no one gets out when it happens again." She snatched the screwdriver and practically ran into the shadows of the corridor. Left alone, Stephen approached the pressure gauge on the wall. The needle was vibrating, but something else caught his attention. From behind the heavy, airtight door leading to the shaft itself, a sound emerged. It wasn't the noise of the drill. It was a long, mournful howl that transitioned into a non-human, gurgling laugh. Stephen froze. The guards at the end of the hall didn't even flinch. They clearly heard it, but for them, it was normal. At that moment, his radio crackled to life, making his heart leap into his throat. "Stephen, this is Marcus. Why are you idling by airlock 4? You've still got 3 units on your schedule. Keep moving." They were watching him. They knew everything. Marcus kept a close eye on Stephen through the cameras, so he had to move carefully. Stephen made a show of diligently checking the valves, but his real focus was finding a blind spot, a place where the surveillance system's lens couldn't reach. He found it in a narrow maintenance crawl space between Sector G and the main generator hall. There, behind a tangle of rusted pipes, was a small niche. Stephen shone his flashlight and noticed that one of the wall panels wasn't properly secured. Prying it loose with his knife, he discovered a hidden cache. Inside lay a small, leather-bound notebook, darkened by moisture and grease. On the first page, a jagged hand had scrawled, "Property of Arthur Miller." If you're reading this, it means I'm no longer on the roster of the living, or I'm no longer myself. Stephen felt a chill run down his spine. Miller was the very specialist he had been hired to replace. Human Resources had told him Arthur had resigned for family reasons. He began flipping through the pages quickly, listening for footsteps in the corridor. November 12th. We've reached the 4,000-meter mark. The drill hit a cavity. It's not just a cave, it's a structure. Perfectly smooth walls made of a material that no drill bit can penetrate. But the strangest part is the heat. There's heat coming from the shaft, smelling of old blood and ozone. November 19th. Kowalski went missing today. They searched for him for 6 hours, found him in the locker room. He was just standing there, staring at the wall. When they called out to him, he turned around. Stephen, he didn't have his own eyes anymore. Or rather, the eyes were the same, but the look in them, that's how a predator looks at meat. He didn't recognize his wife in the photograph, said it was just a biological specimen. November the 24th. They brought something up from the shaft. The container is doused in liquid nitrogen, but I heard something scratching inside. Marcus ordered all technicians to double their dose of antidepressants. But I'm not taking them. I see what they're trying to hide. At night, it's not steam crawling through the vents. It changes shape. It's learning to mimic us. The last entry was written with a trembling hand, the letters barely legible, and the pages were stained with something sticky. December 1st. Don't trust the silence. It's already here. If you hear whispering from the pipes, don't respond. If you see someone on the staff go too long without blinking, run. They want to fully breach the shaft's airlock. They think it's a power source. Fools. It's not a battery. It's a prison. And the lock is almost broken. Help me. The entry ended with a bloody streak trailing to the edge of the page. Stephen slammed the diary shut. At that exact moment, the light in the maintenance passage flickered and died. In total darkness, he heard a distinct sound above his head. Scrape, scrape. As if something very heavy was slowly crawling through the ventilation duct, trying not to make a sound. And then, out of the darkness, right in his ear, came Marcus's calm, agonizingly familiar voice. Stephen, did you find what you were looking for? But Marcus couldn't be here. Stephen had seen him at the security post at the other end of the block just a minute ago. The cold radiating from the figure standing in the shadows was unnatural, even for Antarctica. Stephen froze, his fingers still gripping the edge of the steel panel. Arthur's diary burned against his thigh through the fabric of his jumpsuit like a piece of red-hot coal. I was just checking the line pressure, Stephen's voice wavered, but he forced himself to turn around. Marcus took a step forward. The beam from Stephen's headlamp caught his face. It was perfect, too perfect. On Marcus's cheek, where Stephen had seen a small shaving nick that morning, the skin was now absolutely smooth, like a mannequin's. And his eyes, they didn't reflect the light. They swallowed it, remaining bottomless pits of black. The pressure is normal, Stephen. Return to the habitation block, the thing that looked like Marcus said. The intonations were right, but strange clicking sounds slipped between the words, as if a mechanism inside him was struggling to dial in the correct frequency. Without turning his back on the creature, Stephen slowly backed away toward the exit of the maintenance corridor. As soon as he reached the main, well-lit hallway, he bolted. His heart hammered in his throat, his pulse thumping in his temples. He didn't go to his room. That would be a trap. Instead, he instinctively headed for the medical block, hoping to find the doctor, Elena. Chaos reigned in the med bay. Glass cabinets were shattered. Scattered vials and bandages littered the floor. Stephen dove behind the reception desk when he heard heavy footsteps in the corridor. "Elena?" a voice called out. It was the same technician from the mess hall who had been too afraid to talk that morning. But now he sounded rapturous, almost ecstatic. "Elena, come out. We found it. It is beautiful. It is us. We won't be cold anymore. Never again." Stephen clamped a hand over his mouth to keep from giving himself away. Through a gap between the desk and the wall, he saw the technician. The man walked with a strange, jerky gait, and his fingers, they had grown noticeably longer and were bending backward, resembling spider legs. Once the footsteps faded, Stephen crawled out from his hiding spot. On the doctor's desk, he noticed a glowing monitor. A feed from a camera in the deep shaft, Sector 0, was open. The image was grainy and jittery. In the center of a vast ice hall, carved directly into the ancient glacier, stood an obelisk, black, pulsing, and covered in a network of vein-like ridges. People stood around it, no coats, no hats, just thin thermal undershirts. They were simply standing there, staring at it. And from the top of the obelisk, thin, translucent strands reached out, penetrating their ears, noses, and eye sockets. It's not an infection, Stephen thought, his mind racing. It's replacement. He realized the base was already living a life of its own, an alien life. The walls vibrated with that same wet breathing he had heard in the vents. Turning around, he saw a message on the medbay wall, written in dried blood. "We are one." Stephen pulled out Arthur's diary and flipped to the very last page. There, beneath the bloodstain, was a tiny postscript he hadn't noticed before. "Radio won't help. They control the signal. Whatever goes out over the airwaves isn't us. If you want to stop this, look for the old Harlow 3 snowmobile in the hangar. The key to the explosives cache is in its glove box. If we can't leave, we must bury this place with us. Let the ice take back what is hers." Stephen gripped the diary tight. The path to the hangar lay across the entire base, and he no longer knew which of the people he encountered were still human, and which were merely shells. The air in the corridors had grown thick and humid, like a tropical rainforest, despite the wall thermometers reading minus 15 degrees Celsius, 5 degrees Fahrenheit. Stephen picked his way through the maintenance tunnels, careful not to touch the walls. A strange residue had begun to grow on the metal, a translucent, slimy film that pulsated in sync with the base's vibrations. As he approached the walkway between the habitation sector and the hangar, he heard an intermittent sob. Elena was sitting in a niche behind the liquid nitrogen tanks. Her white lab coat was torn, and her face was buried in her hands. "Elena," Stephen whispered, keeping his distance. "It's me, Stephen. We have to get out of here. I have a plan." She slowly raised her head. Stephen nearly screamed. Her lower jaw was unnaturally elongated, and thin black threads were erupting from the pores of her neck, just like the ones he had seen on the monitor. But her eyes were still human, filled with pain and realization. "Run, Stephen." Her voice sounded as if she were speaking through water. "It doesn't just copy us, it reprocesses. It's waiting for the plane. 40 people on base. That's just the beginning. They want the world. Out there, beyond the ice." Her body suddenly arched. Stephen saw something move rapidly beneath the skin of her back, snapping her vertebrae with a dry crack. "Run!" she shrieked, and in that same second, a long, fleshy appendage studded with tiny teeth burst from her mouth. Stephen bolted toward the hangar's airlock. Behind him, he heard heavy, sloshing thuds. Elena, or what was left of her, was no longer walking. She was sprinting on all fours, her body contorting at impossible angles. He dove into the hangar and slammed his weight against the locking lever. The door screeched shut, and a massive impact followed a split second later. The metal buckled. Without looking back, Stephen sprinted into the depths of the vast, dark chamber, filled with snowmobiles and tracked haulers. It was dark here, with only dim emergency lights illuminating the rows of machinery. Stephen began to feverishly search for the Harlow 3. "Where are you, you old clunker?" he muttered, shining his flashlight on the hull numbers. Harlow 1, Harlow 2, and there it was, in the furthest corner, buried under empty fuel drums. The snowmobile looked ancient, its body covered in rust, but Stephen didn't need the engine. He ripped open the glove box. Inside, among old maps and greasy gloves, lay a heavy brass key with a tag labeled C4 Storage. Next to it was a yellowed photograph of Arthur Miller with a woman. On the back, it read, "Forgive me, Sarah. I won't let this thing get to you." Stephen squeezed the key in his fist. Now he had a goal, but his relief was short-lived. From above, on the metal rafters near the hangar ceiling, he heard a rustling sound. He raised his flashlight and froze. The entire ceiling of the hangar was draped in massive cocoons made of that same slimy matter. Inside the cocoons, he could make out the outlines of human bodies. Some of them were still twitching. "Stephen," Marcus's voice drifted out from somewhere in the darkness. "What do you need the key for? You know explosives are very dangerous. We can't have you hurting yourself. We're one family now." Figures began to emerge from the shadows between the haulers. Marcus, the cooks, the same technicians from the mess hall. They stood in a semicircle, blocking the exit. Every single one of them had the exact same face, a frozen, polite smile, and dead, pitch-black eyes. "The plane arrives in 36 hours, the Marcus thing continued. "We need a lot of space for the new guests. Your body would be a perfect fit for the pilot." Stephen slowly backed toward the snowmobile, his hand fumbling in his pocket for the flare gun he had snatched from the med bay. "Family, huh?" Stephen rasped, leveling the flare gun. "I've already got one, and we don't make a habit of growing tentacles." He pulled the trigger. A brilliant magnesium charge hissed out of the barrel, striking the creature that was once the cook square in the chest. The flash blinded Stephen for a split second, but the effect was instantaneous. The thing didn't just catch fire, it started to boil. The creature let out a non-human, ultrasonic shriek that made Stephen's ears ring and sent a thin trickle of blood from his nose. It smelled like burnt rubber and rotting meat. The other people in the circle flinched back for a moment from the intolerable light. That was his chance. Stephen lunged forward, sprinting past the cook writhing in agony. Marcus tried to cut him off, and at that moment, his camouflage completely shattered. Marcus's jaw split in two, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth, while bone blades erupted from his jumpsuit sleeves, where his fingers should have been. "Stop!" the creature grated, but Stephen had already dived under a massive hauler. He crawled across the icy floor, feeling claws scrape against the machine's metal above him. The things were fast now, their movements jerky and erratic. Stephen rolled out from the other side of the hauler and saw the door to C4 storage. It was only 30 feet away, but Elena was blocking the path. Her body barely resembled a human anymore. She stood on 6 limbs, her head twisted backward. "Stephen, it hurts. Help," she whispered, but her limbs were already tensing for a pounce. Stephen grabbed a jug of antifreeze from a nearby shelf and hurled it at her, followed immediately by a second flare. The explosion turned Elena into a living torch. Without looking back, Stephen bolted for the door. His hand shook as he jammed the key into the lock, just as a cold, slimy loop lashed around his ankle. He was yanked back so hard, his chin slammed into the threshold. It was Marcus. His arm had extended 10 feet, turning into an elastic tether. "You won't leave," the creature clicked. In a panic, Stephen scrambled across the floor and felt a heavy pipe wrench dropped by one of the mechanics. Pivoting, he brought it down with all his might on the taut tentacle. There was a wet crunch. The creature recoiled, and Stephen, scrambling to his feet, threw the door open and tumbled inside. He slammed the heavy steel door shut and threw the bolt a second before something weighing a ton slammed into it. The impact was so violent, the hinges groaned. Stephen slid down the door, gasping for air. He was safe for a few minutes. Shining his flashlight around the room, he saw stacks of wooden crates marked "Danger Explosives." But in the corner of the warehouse, in the shadows, he noticed movement. Someone was sitting there. "Arthur?" Stephen asked softly, hoping for a miracle. The man in the corner slowly raised his head. It really was Arthur Miller, judging by the tattered remains of his clothes. But his face, it was half consumed by a black obelisk growing right out of the warehouse wall. The walls here weren't just pulsing. They were covered in a living web of veins, pumping black sludge from the depths of the earth. "Too late, kid," Arthur wheezed. In his hand was a detonator, but his fingers had already turned into roots, growing into the floor. "They aren't just on the base, they are the base. This whole complex, it's their body now." "Arthur, I'm getting you out of here," Stephen said, taking a step forward. But Miller let out a pained shriek, and his body jerked like a taut wire. "No, don't you dare!" Arthur coughed, a thick black liquid splashing from his mouth. "I'm not a separate being anymore. I'm their sensor. If you try to free me, IT will feel it instantly. Listen to me, kid. There's no time." The pounding on the warehouse door grew quieter, replaced by a sickening squelch. Stephen looked up to see black tendrils, like living cables, starting to seep through the ventilation grate. "The obelisk in the shaft is the brain," Arthur whispered, his eyes rolling back. "But the base, this metal, these walls, they've become its body. C4 storage sits right above the main power hub. You don't need to go to the shaft. You need to rig the foundation here." "But how do I get out?" Stephen asked, feverishly cracking open a crate of explosives. "The elevators are locked, and the hangar is crawling with those things." In the corner, behind the detonator rack, Arthur pointed with a twitching finger. "An old drainage well. It leads to ice caves that breach the surface half a mile from here. There's an emergency vehicle hidden there, an old snowcat. If you're fast enough." Stephen began rapidly lining the warehouse's support columns with plastic explosives. His hands shook, and the sound of the bass breathing grew louder. It wasn't just background noise anymore. The floor beneath him rose and fell rhythmically, like a massive rib cage. "Arthur, come with me. I'll find a way." "Shut up," Miller's head snapped up. His eyes turned pitch black for a second. "It's listening. It knows what you're planning. It's already here." At that moment, the warehouse ceiling collapsed with a roar. Instead of concrete slabs, a massive heap of flesh and metal crashed down. It was something assembled from the bodies of guards and technicians, a giant mass of limbs, faces, and bones fused together by black slime. In the center of the mass, Stephen recognized Marcus's face. "Steven!" the creature roared with 100 voices at once. "You don't understand. There is no death. There is only us." Stephen snatched up the last detonator and set the timer for 5 minutes. "See you in hell, Marcus!" He bolted toward the drainage well. Arthur looked at him one last time. His gaze held a plea and an infinite weariness. "Blow it, Stephen. Press the button," Miller screamed. Stephen dove into the narrow, frozen drainage pipe just as the multi-armed thing slammed into the spot where he had stood a second before. He slid down the ice chute, hearing the creature's furious roar and the screech of tearing metal behind him. The timer on his wrist ticked down relentlessly. 4:50, 4:49. The pipe ended in a sharp drop, and Stephen was spat out into a natural ice cave. It was dark and incredibly cold. His flashlight caught the silhouette of the snowcat, a tracked vehicle covered in a thick layer of frost. Stephen jumped into the cab. The key in the ignition turned with difficulty. The engine sputtered, spat out a cloud of black smoke, and stalled. "Not now! Please!" he pleaded, turning the key again. Outside, from the passage he had just escaped, black threads appeared. The obelisk was stretching its roots into the caves, trying to reach the fugitive. 02:15. The engine roared to life. Stephen slammed the gas, and the vehicle, breaking its icy shackles, lunged forward into the darkness of the tunnel leading to the surface. The snowcat roared out of the ice grotto, bursting through a snowdrift and onto the surface. The blinding, frigid light of the Antarctic sun momentarily robbed Stephen of his sight. He floored the gas, driving the machine as far from the epicenter as possible. 0010, 0009. Stephen looked back. A mile or so behind him, the endless white plain began to sag. A massive sinkhole formed where Point Zero lay buried deep beneath the ice. 00:01. 00:00. The earth shuddered. At first, there was no sound, only a visual distortion in the air. Then, a colossal pillar of fire and smoke erupted from beneath the snow, mixed with twisted metal and chunks of ancient ice. The shockwave overtook the snowcat, nearly flipping the multi-ton vehicle. Stephen slammed on the brakes and stepped out of the cab. His ears were ringing, and a black mushroom cloud rose on the horizon. Deep within, the fuel reserves had detonated along with the plastic explosives, and, as Stephen hoped, the heart of the beast itself. The silence that followed the explosion was absolute. No howling wind, no roar of drills. Stephen dropped to his knees, greedily gulping the freezing air. He had won. He was alive. An hour later, as the smoke began to thin, Stephen spotted a speck in the sky. The drone of C-130 engines, the very transport meant to bring new victims, grew louder. The pilots clearly saw the smoke and were descending to investigate. Stephen pulled the flare gun from his pocket. One last charge remained. He raised his arm to fire and catch their attention, but suddenly, he froze. His gaze fell on his own palm, the one gripping the handle. Beneath the skin, right at the wrist, a hair-thin black vein pulsed almost imperceptibly. It didn't look like a normal vessel. It moved, rhythmically, in sync with his own heart. Stephen felt a strange warmth spreading through his arm. The fear that had driven him all this time was suddenly replaced by a strange, frightening calm. "Stephen!" a voice whispered in his head. It didn't belong to Marcus or Arthur. It was his own voice, but it sounded as if thousands were speaking in unison. "We did not die." Stephen looked at the approaching plane. In his reflection in the snowcat's window, he saw his pupils dilate for a split second, filling the entire iris with absolute blackness. He slowly lowered the flare gun. Why signal them if they were going to find him anyway? They always find a way out. The plane's skis touched the snow, and it began taxiing toward him. Stephen smiled. It was a polite, frozen smile, the exact double of Marcus's. "Welcome to the family," he whispered, taking a step toward the rescuers. White silence reigned over Antarctica once more. But beneath that ice, and now in the blood of the survivor, beat the heart of something that had waited millions of years for its moment. And now, that moment had come. 3 days later, contact with the C-130 transport plane was lost somewhere over the ocean en route to South America. The last thing the dispatcher heard was a strange clicking sound and a calm voice saying, "We aren't cold anymore.